are watching your community channel, McLean Hunter Cable TV.
Good afternoon. I'm Ron Moore of Moore Gallery in Hamilton, and I'm here this afternoon to speak with one of Canada's leading abstract painters, Gordon Rayner. We currently have an exhibition of his work on in our Hess Street Gallery, running from November the 7th until November the 30th. We'll spend a half hour talking with Gordon, and I think you'll find it very interesting hearing about his life and his career. And if you have time, please come to our gallery in Hess Village and see this exhibition. It's a magnificent show. Anyways, beside me, this is Gordon Rayner. And Gord, what I'd like to do is start by talking about your background, talking about your childhood and your early influences. And maybe if you'd start talking there, we can go through your career.
Born in Toronto, 1935. As I was explaining to the woman who was interviewing me for the newspaper, my father being a commercial artist, principally an illustrator, a very fine one, and an amateur painter in a sense, in that he was a professional in the commercial art world and painted on the side, which a lot of his generation did. He was a contemporary, in fact, served his apprenticeship with Jack Bush when they were both young men in the commercial art world. Excuse me. I have a terrible cold, so I have to apologize about that. As I was saying, often I can recall these wonderful times when I was a very young boy, 3 and 4 and 5 years old, where instead of being sent to my room for being bad or for being good or whatever, I would be sent to my room with a pile of art supplies, old drawing paper and charcoal, and there was always in the commercial art world, having to meet deadlines. The artists often work all hours of the day and night to get the ads done. This was advertising in the print media. So there was always our dining room table where we had supper, for example, dinner, was a tilt table, which was always magical to me. And of course, it was merely a drawing table. But as a young boy, I was really quite impressed by this magic table. My father would be at home working a lot in the evenings. So there was always art supplies around, constantly. And I'm of the belief that that argument as to whether we are products of genetic inheritance or are we products of behavior, and environment, I'm convinced it's probably a combination of both. Certainly the environment in this case had a lot to do with it. Now there's a minor contradiction here because on the genetic side, it so happens that my grandfather was an English landscape painter who painted all the leaves on all the trees of all, and all the wool and all the sheep lying in all the grass in all the fields of England. And my great-great-grandfather showed along with beside Turner, of all things, in the Royal Academy in London. So it does go back historically. But I emphasize that I think because I admired my father and wanted to emulate him in the healthiest kind of way, that had more to do with me becoming an artist than anything else.
So your connection with your father was the first thing that got you rolling as far as painting.
Yes, indeed.
What about schooling? What was your background as far as through the school years?
Was fairly academic, and I was a bright kid in public school and was pushed ahead a grade, and I could always I had some kind of natural ability. I enjoyed art, and as much as I enjoyed sports, you know. But when I went to high school and I took an art course for a very brief time, and then I left high school when I was just turning 16 because I wasn't doing well. My whole attitude was kind of naughty, and I just discovered this amazing phenomenon called girls, and
Yes, I know what you mean.
and but what was happening more importantly was that in those days, it sounds like eons ago, but unfortunately it doesn't seem to exist today. They had the old apprenticeship system, which I still am an advocate of, where I could learn more by going out into the field. Keeping in mind now that I wanted to be an advertising artist, an illustrator. My goal was to knock Norman Rockwell off the cover of Saturday Evening Post, you know.
Right.
And again, had been painting with my father on weekends and things like that in the Don Valley, out in the country, in the local, and also going into the bush a lot, going up north and doing a lot of learning about Indian lore, and Ernest Thompson Seton and all that sort of thing were very influential. And of course painting alongside my dad and some of his friends. I must have painted as many barns as there are in southern Ontario, you know, that kind of tradition.
What age would you have been at this time?
Well, it's going back to being 13 years old.
Is that right?
Yeah.
No.
And then so I went into the apprenticeship system at $18 a week, and I was fortunate enough through a lot of hard work. I thought my father was going to get me a job, of course, but that wasn't the case. I ended up, he said 3 pages of yellow pages and said, here, start at A and go around with your little sample case and get interviews and see if you can get a job. Well, I ended up getting a job with a company called Wookie Bush and Winter, it's W, and I think there was only one other firm on the 3rd page left after that. So that was my first lesson about the real world.
Yes.
Fortunately, though, and really, really lucky, the Bush was Jack Bush of Painters 11, and renowned Canadian artist, who became like a secondary father figure to me. I worked with him for about 3 years, and as an apprentice, doing messages, cleaning the office, and practicing, and he encouraged me to go to night school and do figure drawing, which he incidentally kept up all his life, even after he turned into evolved into an abstract artist. He always believed that drawing, the ability to draw anything, was at the basis of all art, regardless of how abstract or how modern it was. And I concur, I agree. So it was at that time that, I'm skipping a little ahead of you, but at that time it was a coincidence again that the Painters 11 was being formed. Often in the offices of Jack, where they would have these meetings, and I would be asked to stay after work and serve drinks and so on, and listen to them scream at each other and try to hammer out a manifesto for their for what they had in common.
This must have been a very exciting time for you. You know, as a young artist, how old would you have been at that time?
Well, I'm getting up to be about somewhere between the ages of 16 and 18 or something like that.
Yeah.
I beg your pardon. I had been continuing to paint, and this abstract art, this modern art, didn't mean anything to me. In fact, I was rather opposed to it.
Yeah.
Again, so was my father. He thought it was no significance at all. But around this time, 2 movies came out. One, Moulin Rouge, about Toulouse-Lautrec, and the other was The Lust for Life, with Kirk Douglas's Van Gogh. I mean, highly romanticized versions of both these great artists' lives, but very, very influential. And overnight, I was not painting like second-rate Tom Thompson, who has been a great influence to me. I was painting like a second or third-rate Vincent Van Gogh, you see. It was a kind of a great leap and a revelation to discover, if I can, I mean, one discovers these things by yourself in a way, but often through outside influences. But I discovered, if you will, Vincent Van Gogh as if nobody else had ever heard of him or knew of him before. I mean, talk about ill-educated and talk about naive. And I think I was probably more educated than the average student regarding painting or art, fine art, that terrible term, but we have to use it, than most. But nevertheless, for example, there had never been a Picasso shown in the Ontario, then the Toronto Art Gallery, ever, up to that point. I assume they might have had a Van Gogh around once in a while. So, although it's conservative now, it was much worse then. So I was painting these. I was going out and buying. By this time, I'd left home, and I was still, of course, still working and painting at night. And I was doing these enormous paintings that must have been about that big. But I would go out and buy a bottle of Chianti when they used to have the straw wrapping around the bottle. You know, very terribly romantic, bohemian. And I'd drink my subject and paint it at the same time. But in these great gobs of paint, I recall thinking, how in the world could poor old Vincent, as I got to know him, how in the world could he afford all this thick, thick paint? So anyway, I was doing these sort of second-rate Van Goghs and stretching out a little bit. And in retrospect, I look back and I see me drifting from a fairly skilled young man at naturalistic art, representational art, and starting to become, without knowing it, becoming more and more abstract, because Van Gogh is I mean, you can tell his subject matter is from nature, but it's highly distorted, and it's very imaginative and powerful, huh? I mean, those starry nights just aren't that way.
Yeah, that's right.
He showed us a new way to look at the skies, for example.
Yeah.
So that was starting, that was interesting me. Then an enormous eruption happened in my life. I think Time magazine and Life, when it was a weekly periodical, came out almost simultaneously. The Time magazine covered a large spread on a group of mostly men who were based in New York City that we referred to as abstract expressionists. And they sort of, Time covered about 10 of them with small color reproductions and sort of a sarcastic prose style of writing regarding this new art. And Life magazine covered only one of them, but with marvelous, great photographs, full-page photographs by a man named Hans Nemuth, who was a poet and a friend of Jackson Pollock, and had photographed this man who had dribbled the paint all over these huge pieces of canvas on the floor, and I thought, that's it. I mean, now they're pulling the wool over the sheep's eyes now. And I'm not a very political person, I'm not politically active, but here was one time in my life that I was ready to march, alone if necessary, in front of the Museum of Modern Art in New York to tell the world that this was the end of real art. I mean, it was over. This was, after the Second World War, and these people were just devastating our brains, you know, this is horrid.
What date was this? About what age were you at this point?
Oh, I must be getting near to being 20, I guess.
Yeah, so you're still very young.
20, yeah. But very, very involved.
Yeah.
And also, the emphasis was shifting from commercial art interests, by which I made my living, to this other kind of art, painting, particularly, not abstract painting at this time. What happened, though, is I was intelligent enough, if I may say so, to realize if I was going to fight this, I was obviously moved and disturbed by this stuff, but I didn't know why and what it was. So I decided I needed ammunition to fight against it. So I began to read about it and study it, and I made my first trip to the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, and I saw my first real examples in the corporeal. I mean, Rothko, for heaven's sakes, these little dull little red pictures in Time magazine of a blob. I thought, oh my God. And then when I will never forget it, I looked down the hallway, and there was a Rothko at the end of the hallway, beautifully lit, and the damn thing was just throbbing like this. Boom, boom, boom. And it created I felt like I could put my arm into it up to my shoulder, you know. And aside from the deep space that the Renaissance dealt with, I'd never experienced anything like this before. It was very confusing. So then the next thing, still not convinced, but starting to change. The next thing was to go to New York City for the first time, and which I did. And there's where I saw my first de Koonings. And Willem de Kooning became my mentor. Within 1 year of being the worst enemy, I was #1 convert. And in fact, only once in my life did I ever have a toothache from the painting, and I'm sure it was from the painting. And it was a de Kooning. I had to run the whole length of the Metropolitan Museum in a Sunday afternoon with 1 million people there to try and find a drugstore to get something for my tooth, because there was nothing wrong with my tooth. I didn't have a cavity. That damn de Kooning gave me a toothache. Now that's powerful.
Yes, that's for sure.
I've
That's
got to
for
meet
sure.
him and tell him that story someday. Anyway, the point is that I was overwhelmed, and quite convinced. They were marvelously powerful works, and they were dealing not with recognizable images particularly. Some were sort of inspired by nature or figure, but they dealt with more of the essence of what things were, and the essence of maybe what life in in America, in New York City in particular, what it was like, the pace, the speediness with which the works were done. And I don't mean that they were tossed off. I mean the brushstroke of de Kooning was as fast as a New York cab driver, you know, and as literal as that, you know, that would be an influence.
Yeah.
So by that time, back in Toronto, I was doing I thought the only person in the world doing these de Koonings. They weren't, I mean, they were almost direct copies. And I was convinced nobody had ever heard of them up here, and I was going to be famous at the age of 19. And it didn't take long to realize that there were 50,000 Americans and Canadians and Japanese and French people who were doing second-hand de Koonings also, about my age. So what became apparent was that something I tell my students, that it's good to face and show, obviously, your influences, because you paint your way in one end of your influence, and you totally embrace it, soak it up like a blotter, and then you paint your way out the other end. And what, in fact, one is doing is creating yourself. Why de Kooning meant more to me than any of the other abstract expressionists doesn't really matter. I pondered that, but I don't care. I don't even know. But something clicked. The same way it clicked with Tom Thomson, same way it clicked with Van Gogh. And by the way, if you trace that lineage, there's a nice, they have a lot in common. There's a lot of strength and physical nature, the corporeal kind of paint that they use. It's not thin washes, it's not delicate, it's really gutsy stuff.
Yes, that's right.
So eventually I realized that there wasn't enough Rayner, and by this time I was getting into my early 20s and doing a lot more painting and a hell of a lot less commercial art. And I was married by this time and had a little girl, and straining to make a living. Making a living wasn't difficult, but the time was troublesome, because I had a 9-to-5er, and as I mentioned earlier, commercial art, you got to work overtime a lot. And yet I'm staying up to 3 in the morning painting, which was my main influence, my main interest. So needless to say, I lost something like 16 jobs in 5 years. But I was always very good at the sort of facile aspects of commercial art. I didn't strive to elevate myself in that business any longer. I stayed at sort of mediocrity, of which there is an awful lot of it in commercial art. I have enormous respect for commercial artists who are top of the mark. Indeed, there's some wonderful designers and illustrators and so on. But simultaneously, in retrospect, I look back and realize that the Painters 11, men and women who had got together in order to show publicly abstract and non-objective painting for the first time in Toronto's history, they had to band together because, first of all, they didn't have the strength, so to speak, to show individually at this point, and no gallery, of which there was something like 5 maybe in the city of Toronto, private gallery, would have anything to do with them, except the Roberts Gallery took a chance. They had a nice association, I believe, with Town and Jack Bush, because they'd shown previously there. They were doing work that was middling, somewhere before the between the naturalistic early paintings and totally abstract paintings. So they took a chance on Painters 11, and then it caused a great uproar in the city, and it was about time. It was the first time that there was anything really, since, I guess, Group of 7, or David Milne and all those boys, that anything really that astonishing had happened in Toronto. Now, I was still, as I reiterate, I was still not completely convinced, but at this time, with a dear friend of mine who was then a 4th-year Ontario College of Art student named Dennis Burton, one of Canada's best artists, living out west now. He and I went to Hart House, where Painters 11 were having, I think, their second show, second or third maybe. And they had by this time improved immensely, by the way, and their scale they'd all been tuned into New York. And they had Clement Greenberg come up, and that's history, which you can read about. It's very interesting because he was all for them, and Harold Town wouldn't have anything to do with him. He didn't want a Yankee in his studio, and I mean, it's all in the history books, but it's significant. Dennis and I went to this Hart House show, and I think it was an Oscar Cahan painting that blew Dennis away. But for me, it was a Bill Ronald. A magnificent painting. I still get goosebumps when I think about the experience. And so, literally, Denny and I, it was a Sunday afternoon, went back to our little Victorian house. We had the attic that we shared, three guys. Smitty wasn't around, but we had like shared a bedroom for a studio with facing away from one another. We did our first abstract paintings, and they were enormous. I think they might have been 2 by 3 feet. Something like that. I mean, God, it was off the floor, a big piece of masonite like this, you know. And of course, we didn't know. Didn't know what we were doing, and we found out. We complimented each other profusely about these 2 terrible paintings. I'm sure they were just, and we found out pretty fast that it sure as hell wasn't as easy as it might appear, you know. But nevertheless, we had a lot of basic trainings in the application of paint, composition, and mixing of colors, and all of these academic aspects which are applicable to most abstract painting. So it wasn't too long, let's say 2 years of intense work, that soon and Bush, of course, working with Bush, he allowed me, when my chores were done, he told me to go to night school and draw. He told me to practice. That was his word, practice. He said one great thing to me, among others. He said, young Gord, he'd always call me that because he knew my dad, right? Who's got the same name. He'd say, if you're going to be an artist, and I don't care what kind, if you're going to be an artist, you have to think about art all the time. And I said, yes, okay, thank you, sir. And he said, no, wait a minute, I mean all the time, every minute of your day and night, and dream about it also. You can't get it out of your mind. Don't think about anything else. And he was dead serious. And I think he was right. It certainly impressed me. And he said, if you're not thinking about it, you catch yourself not thinking about it, slap yourself on the wrist and force yourself to think about it.
Yeah.
Great teacher, wonderful man. And so what eventually evolved, of course, is that there was a little framing shop in the old Greenwich village of Toronto, Gerard and Bay area, and a fellow named Av Isaacs, who was a business administration university, something like that, across the road from the nurse's residence. And he, being a smart businessman, and by the way, at this point, confidentially not knowing anything about art, he and a pal opened a little tiny shop, called it the Greenwich Gallery, and what the deal was is they were making the frames for all the graduation pictures for all the nurses, and they made enough money to pay for their tuition for the next year. Now, I tell you that because 2 or 3 guys came out of the woodwork. Michael Snow and Graham Coftree had just come back on their first trips to Europe and as graduate students from the Ontario College, and a few others. And they saw this little shop, and they said, "Mister, can we put our pictures in your window?" And Av said, "Sure, why not? We've got nothing in there but dust anyway." And that was the beginning, the birth of what we now call the Isaacs Gallery, probably the most famous and the best, most influential gallery in the history of modern painting and sculpture in Canada, for the era that it represents. Huh? Now I saw these Coftrees that looked like Rufino Tamayos, and the Snows that looked like Paul Clays, and I said, I've got to meet these guys, because I'm backtracking a little. I was just getting away from Van Gogh and just finding out about the painters of that sort. So consequently, I did meet them. We became very good friends. Isaacs became more emphasis on the painting and upgraded his framing business, moved around the corner to a more decent-looking premises. Anyway, it's still called the Greenwich Gallery, and started to put on one-man shows and study and become an art dealer. I mean, he literally studied art. I don't think he knew much, be preface to that, but learned it. Indeed, he did. So consequently, I had I approached him, and he came and saw my work, and I had my first show there with another young artist named Joyce Whelan, who's one of Canada's greatest artists, and was Mike Snow's wife at that time. And we showed together, and since then I've been with the Isaacs Gallery ever since.
Well, you've certainly had a tremendous career, that's for sure, to this point. You've got a lot of time left. Let's talk a little bit about this exhibition.
It's great. I was delighted with your
so
selection.
Too. I think so too. I think it's really fantastic.
That doesn't sound too egotistical.
Well, no, I'm very pleased with it as well. And
well, you've chosen some extremely strong and quality work.
Yeah, well, I think that if you could spend a minute just talking about the different works in the exhibition. They've spent quite a bit of time taking shots of them. Maybe you can talk a little bit about the constructed paintings and the...
Well, there's a variety of works here that have been selected over... This is a survey, really, of looking back... how far back do we go, Ron?
I think the earliest we have is a work on paper, 1974.
Yeah. There's work on paper, collages. There's large acrylic paintings. There's the fan paintings. These are derived, because I live in Chinatown, so I'm surrounded by and fans are inherently beautiful, so I said, why not do some fan-shaped paintings, you know? That's the kind of influence that I mean by environment.
Yes.
I work in the bush in my cabin up near Magnetawan, and a lot of my works in this show are inspired by the landscape and that Precambrian light, which is very different than the Mediterranean where I've lived. You know, you find out more about your own country by traveling to other places.
Yeah.
You know, the works also include constructed pieces done in oil and found materials. They're more my city-fied kind of paintings, if you will. Yeah. The back streets of Spadina, the back alleys of Spadina and College are just a found object paradise, huh?
Yeah.
And garbage night on Spadina with all the tailor's materials and the fabric and the stuff that's thrown out is marvelous for artists, for collage materials and so on. I get my students to go down there every week and pick up stuff. But I think we've only got a little time left, so I just want to emphasize that what has been equally significant to me, and if there's any young artists out there, I can't impress this upon you strongly enough, travel and in the investigation and absorption of other cultures and other art forms is as important as any art education, any apprenticeship, any kind of study, any kind of work. And I've traveled a lot and prepared always before I went. I've been, for example, involved with Buddhism because of art. I studied the Tibetan Buddhist art before I went there, so that because I wanted to know what I was looking at. And then I found out then about their religion and all the beautiful aspects of that. So it enhances one. And it's through the art that one can become enhanced, that one's life can become enhanced. On the other hand, something like the Mexican experience, where a country I love dearly, and I just spent 3 months there last winter. I was very lucky. The indigenous Indian art, let alone the big mural painters of the 30s and the socialist painters and that and the architecture, but the indigenous Indian art it's not a cottage industry. It's thriving. Those peoples those native peoples are fighting for and are succeeding in maintaining their culture against all odds. I mean, against the Spanish invasion back then, right up to the tourist invasion today. And those kinds of things are very, very influential to me.
Yeah. Well, I think that basically the painting that you've certainly done in your career will stand the test of time, and I certainly want to thank you very much for this exhibition. It's just terrific.
Well, thank you also. Yeah. I'm delighted.
That's great.
You are watching your community channel, McLean Hunter Cable TV.